What's going on, everybody? Got a lot of free time on my hands and a lot of ink in my fingers, and today I'm using some of that free time to talk about an ink, specifically KWZ Old Gold. But first, KWZ is a small ink manufacturer from Warsaw, Poland. The founder of KWZ is a chemist. He has a PhD in everything. Chemistry has a very wide range of focuses and uses, so that chemistry background doesn't necessarily mean these inks will be scientifically awesome. For all I know, he could be a semiconductor chemist, which is not related to ink at all, but it's probably at least partially related. Now, KWZ is a fairly well-known ink brand, but they are not as easy to find as most other ink brands, at least as far as US retailers go. They are offered by a ton of European stores from a ton of different European countries, which makes sense. Poland is in Europe, which is probably easier for a small company to distribute to, and they aren't hard to find from US retailers. They're just not as widely available as I expected. Now, I don't have a bottle because I got this ink in a sample form, but KWZ's inks come in 60 milliliter bottles that look like this. And those 60 milliliter bottles are only $15 US. That is a fantastic price. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, that fantastic price isn't available from a ton of retailers in the US, but from the places that do sell it, it is a great value. So if you do find a retailer that does offer KWZ's inks, they offer a wide variety of colors, and this one is yellow. It is actually the first yellow that I'm doing a review on, and I'm a little bit confused about this ink color. Part of me thinks that it looks like some kind of old, dried, radioactive mustard, which is not great. But then, sometimes when I look at it, instead I think, wow, this is a very beautifully shading golden ink, which is fitting for an ink called Old Gold. So, half the time I look at it and I think, yuck. But the other half I think, ooh. So, I don't know about the color itself, but let's see how it performs as an ink. So here are my testing sheets. First we have Clairefontaine. Then we have Tomoe River. We have Graphilo. We have B7 paper, which is not B7 sized. That's the name of the paper. It is a stupid name, but it is a great paper, so I'm going to use it. And then now we're also including Yu-sari paper, which is not Yu-sari sized, because that is not a paper size. It's just a good paper. Now the first thing that I can point out is that ink has a great amount of shading. In the writing and in the swatches, you see a wide variation between the gold, what I would call a gold color, to a very dark, almost brown color. It is a very saturated ink. However, if you are trying to cover a large area with just your pen and not whatever you swatch with, you won't see any of that shading. In fact, you barely see any of the shading at the beginning and end of the line, which I've seen happen in a few inks, but most of the time either I see that the ink color fades or you see the shading in the strokes. And here you just see one consistent color. It doesn't fade, but it also doesn't really shade. Now except for on Graphilo, which always takes forever to dry, here it took over a minute. This was actually a pretty quick drying ink. It was somewhere between 40 and 50 seconds on B7, which is the other long drying paper. But on all the other papers, Tomoe River, it was dry by 40 seconds. Clairefontaine, which dries quick all the time, it was dry around 25 seconds. And Yu-sari was around 35 seconds dry time, which is a pretty fast, but not the fastest drying ink that I've ever used. So it does dry pretty quickly. And it doesn't bleed or feather on pretty much every paper. Even on lower tier fountain pen friendly paper like Muji and Kokuyo campus paper, which I would consider the bottom two. This performed very well. On cheap copy paper, you might have some issues, but if you're going to use crappy paper, you're going to expect crappy results. Now, part of the lack of bleeding and feathering, I think, is that there is basically no lubrication in this ink. I found that it was not bone dry, not terrible. It flowed, but it did struggle to flow out of some of my drier writing pens. It is usable, but in my opinion, it is just a bit too dry. For my tastes, I would want it to be wetter, but if you have an uncontrollably wet pen, this might be a good ink to tame that pen. But, well, it doesn't flow very well. It does shade pretty well. Now, it is not the greatest shading ink. It is not a crazy amount of shading. The variation is really just you see the darker tone where the ink pulls up with a lighter tone for most of the letter. And even in some letters, you don't actually get any shading at all. So it's not the most shading you can get in an ink, but I do like the way that the shading looks. It is a very pretty looking shading. It is just not a ton of shading. There's also not a ton of sheen. There is, in fact, no sheen. I didn't see any on any of the papers that I tested this on. You can see there's like a little ring of darker color around some of the swatches. This is not sheen. This is like the opposite of sheen. This is basically black. So it does not sheen at all. Now, it is a yellow ink, and yellow is generally very hard to read because it is a generally light color, but this ink is actually pretty legible. As far as readability goes though, I still think that it is kind of just in the middle. It is not super duper readable, but it is not impossible to read. As far as yellow inks go, I would say that this is probably on the higher end of what a yellow is able to be without it becoming a brown ink or an orange ink. So while it is not the most readable ink, as far as a yellow goes, this is probably as good as it gets. And it will maintain some of that readability even if you get your ink wet, because as you can see in all of the papers, you can still see a dark line within the splotch of wetness. It is not going to remain a yellow line. Whatever the darkest dye is, to give it this dark tone is what's going to remain. But if you get your paper wet, you will still be able to read what you wrote. But it won't be pretty, and I always recommend that you don't get your paper wet. So these were my semi-objective paper writing tests. Now, while I do a drawing demonstration with KWZ Old Gold, I will go over my final thoughts. So after going over this a bunch of times, I'm still a bit conflicted about this color and this ink in general. I don't like the way that this ink flows. And that is a pretty important factor for me when it comes to the inks that I like. But it has so much else going for it. There is no bleeding, there is no feathering, and it is incredibly readable as far as a yellow ink goes. I really think that as far as yellow inks go, if you want it to actually be legible while still appearing yellow, I think that this is probably as good as it gets. And it isn't waterproof, but it is actually pretty impressively water resistant. Now, when it's wet, you lose the yellow color, but still, if your concern is maintaining what you write and you don't care that it stays yellow, that is something that I would not have expected from a yellow ink. And the shading is pretty good too. It's not great, but it is good. Unfortunately, it is just a bit too meh on the things that I care about the most. I don't love the color, and it is a bit too dry. However, at $15 for 60 milliliter bottles and being an actually readable yellow, I think I am leaning towards liking this ink. If you are on the hunt for a yellow and you don't mind a drier ink and you haven't checked out KWZ Old Gold, it is worth checking out. So, with all of that said, that is KWZ Old Gold. I hope you liked the video. If you did, leave a comment telling me how great I am in the comments, or if you didn't like it, tell me why I suck. I will. If you're not the kind of person that likes to leave comments on YouTube videos, you could do all the other YouTube junk. You could like or dislike until YouTube removes those features. You could smash that bell icon, and you could subscribe. Subscribing is always helpful. Some links to where to buy KWZ Old Gold will be listed in the description, and also in that description will be a link to my Instagram. So if you hate my voice and you hate my opinions, but you do like my art and maybe my writing, you can check me out over there because I don't do any talking. So that's all. That was KWZ Old Gold. I hope that you have the best day. Goodbye.